All right, welcome everybody. This is the continuing guest lecture series, the Music Technology guest lecture series, Georgia Southern University for the 2021 academic year, and we are delighted to have with us today Michael Olson, a GS Music Technology alum. Michael Olson is a musical creative whose work is as eclectic as his wardrobe. From writing orchestral pieces for the concert hall to sing-song pop melodies, ambient, or electronic music, Michael's work is ever evolving to new places with new collaborators. He's based in Minnesota, and he has toured extensively throughout the US and Europe. His work has received press and publications such as the Dallas Morning News, Fanfare, NPR, Music Street Journal. His music and production can be heard on more than 40 albums and has been licensed to dozens of TV programs on networks such as MTV, E, ABC, Showtime, TLC, Fox, Animal Planet, VH1, Spike, PBS, and more. His concert music has received nearly 200 performances in the US and throughout the world, including Denmark, Germany, UK, Ireland, Italy, Argentina, India, and Spain, among others. And you can find his music on all major streaming platforms, including his new release, I believe. Is that true, Michael?
Yes.
Yes, you will be able to find that on all streaming platforms, I imagine. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Olson, who will be talking to us today a bit about entrepreneurship and creativity. Thank you for being with us.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, and welcome to everybody in this today. It's kind of fun. I have two former students, Andrew and Artie Evans down there in the corner, also known in our neck of the woods as R2D2, and also the Devons. Eddie and I were at GSU at the same time, so that's kind of fun too. So good to see you, Eddie, and thanks for popping in today. So I was here for Aaron Anderson's talk, and I understood about 7 to 8% of it, which is pretty good for me, having worked with Aaron when he was a young undergraduate, and now seeing him out in the world is pretty remarkable. So that was fun. And I asked John, what should we have a discussion about today? Because I'm not the coding genius of my former student, Aaron Anderson, who lapped me long ago. Could we talk about something out, what would you be interested in? He said, composition, and if you want to talk a bit about entrepreneurship, which is some of where my teaching and practical work goes, that would be good. I remember being a graduate student, both at the master's level and the doctoral level, and having that moment of panic and thinking, what in the world am I going to do with all of my wonderful electroacoustic training, and where is this going to go? And there are so many pathways. And so I think it's helpful in this time of COVID, where the industry is kind of contracted a bit, to take stock of where we are, look towards what the future is, and then maybe just give, like I tell my students, kind of a gut check of where your interests really lie. There's the story that we tell ourselves about where our career perspective goes, and then there's what our actual interests are, and what we're able to accomplish. So I'm going to go through a little bit of my work first, to just play some music and talk about my journey, and then we'll kind of talk more broadly about being an entrepreneur and a technology person in the 21st century. And then I love discussion time. So I know Zoom is kind of a terrible medium for that, but we can try all together to have a bit of a discussion. I think that'll be great. All right. So, and I titled this talk "The Next Turn." That is a bit of an homage to our dear friend and now Chiang Mai resident, Dr. Dan Pittman, who would always talk about the fourth turn and the rebirth and generational theory. And so there's no better way to describe, what your next steps are for those of you leaving the program this year, or for those of you thinking, where am I going to go this next year, to think about this turning, right? And a rebirth into this new cycle of life, and where your careers might go. So I'm excited to talk to you about that today. So I started my career, you graduated from college in the early 2000s, and yes, I did have hair at one point. And at that point, I was touring a lot with various artists and doing a lot of studio work, which led me out onto the road full time. And so I spent 5 years touring around the US and around Europe, making records and playing shows. And that was wonderful. That led me to do a lot of TV and film licensing with my work, which kind of has boomeranged back now with some of the new work that I'm working on licensing to basically a lot of television shows through a bunch of different companies as part of my compositional work. And, that cycle of touring and playing and making records, that was great for my 20s. But, as everything else in life, things turn and things change. And sometimes those choices are yours and sometimes those choices aren't. And so it was about that time I was thinking about going to graduate school, and I was looking at various places around the country and just happened to be driving a car down to Fort Myers, Florida, and made a stop at Georgia Southern to visit. At this time, we weren't in Foy, we were in Hendrix. And so the technology that we had, this was 2008. So the technology we had was we were in an old unrenovated dorm. I don't know if you know where Hendrix Hall is. It's on the other side, like way the other side of campus, around the loop. You go around the loop there. I think it's an administration building now. There's nothing next to it. It was an old 2-floor dorm. You can go check it out. It was unrenovated at that time. They put the whole music department in there for, I think, a semester. It was the first semester, and the second semester we moved back to Foy. And so when I came to visit, before this all happened, we were split between the business building and Hendrix. And John had a rack of books and a Mackie mixer and a computer with 2 Dynaudio speakers. And that was our studio. That's how we started. And the stands for the speakers were made out of cinder blocks with plywood held together with Gorilla Glue. And for the first few Channel Noise concerts, I was there for the first couple ones. I was the only GA at that time. The elevator didn't work. So I had to take, when we finally got back into Foy, I had to take those Gorilla glued stands and carry them, all 8 of them, down the flights of stairs into the hall, set them all up, lug them up the stairs, and then put them all back. And for all of that pain, I was saying one time, John, this is a lot of work. It's taking me all day to do this. And he says, it's very good for you. It's good for you. And then when I left, they split my GA up into 2. So I feel like, this is good historical program knowledge for everyone to have. So when I got to GSU, I was kind of more of a commercial musician, but I was really interested in sound and composing with sound in a different way, looking at sound from a different way. I don't come from a composition undergraduate degree. I come from sort of an industry production degree and then professional activity. And so, one of the challenges that I had at GSU at this time was figuring out what's that evolution in my compositional practice. What can I do to sort of blend the sound worlds of this pop commercial world with this more experimental practice that John was doing. I've always really loved John's music. I love the micro sound stuff. I got very into, built a grain synth granular generator as my master's project. I was way into Curtis Rhodes stuff and Horatio Viaggione. And so that's where my work sort of gravitated to. But along with that was a visual practice. And I really think that during my time at GSU, the video side of things informed my compositional practice a lot more than the other way around. In other words, when we started working in Max and doing generative visuals in class, that visualization of what the music could be was the piece for me that really locked in what the audio side could be, right? So it really informed the process in reverse. So I spent a number of years building a whole lot of micro sound and video pieces. And unlike some people who kind of approach this, from a generative perspective, writing software to generate the clouds or the rhythmic gestures, and the same on the visual side, I kind of went very old school with my approach, which was to kind of follow Curtis Rhodes' initial approach, which is placing individual grains one at a time on the canvas. And so for me, that practice really spoke to me as sort of a producer and having worked in studios for a long time, because at this time, how do you do drum edits? Well, you drag around one little box at a time and nudge the drums around. Beat Detective isn't really that great of software in the early 2000s. And so the Curtis's process, and to some extent Horatio Viaggione's process, was really compelling as sort of a compositional touchstone, where I would just go through and design these gestures, one click, one boom, one at a time, all the way through these 4-minute pieces, and then bounce back into the video realm and just micro montage all of these video pieces. And what I found when I started going out into the field and presenting this work, I was fortunate to have I have about 9 pieces in this space. Took me a long time to build all 9 of these pieces over several years. Is that's not a very common technique. It's not a very common technique for a lot of reasons, but the primary one is it's really time intensive. It's really time intensive. And one of the questions that, when people be like, oh, I really loved your piece and you want to talk about it, they're like, why would you do it that way? Just generate some clouds, write a script to generate a visual and off you go. But the difference is the pieces that are done with this level of detail, they feel different. I'm not saying that they're better. I'm not saying that, that's the only way to do it, but there's a definite, sort of touchstone to craftsmanship and detail that's present in pieces that are constructed based on craftsmanship and detail that aren't, right? And wow, what a good parallel that is for the rest of our compositional practice. Ryan, do you have something to say? Yeah, go ahead.
Is there something that what DAW do you use to do these micro montage pieces?
At that time, it was DP.
So is there something that in general DAWs are missing that could make that easier, do you think, or?
I don't know. At that time, I'm using like 5 or 6 different programs. I'm using the cloud generator, my grain synth program, a bunch of other stuff, and just bouncing audio files in and cutting them up and going to work. The other thing is that really desirable? As someone who teaches a lot of intro technology now to majors, and I've opened it up to non-majors, actually the non-majors are sometimes more interesting than the majors in what they want to do. People have a vision for musical creation that's limited to a facsimile of what they're trying to represent. Does that make sense? And one of the things, for better or worse, that you find as you move further in the field is that doesn't really change. The only thing that changes is the monetization piece, right? If I can get away with writing something that kind of sounds like a copy of something else and make money on it, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to pursue the harder thing because it's harder or because it's 10% better. Does that make sense? So we'll talk a little bit about this more on the entrepreneurship side too. That's also, if you're a software developer, if you're building plugins, right, or pedals or any kind of boutique instrument. See, I'll already get distracted. I get distracted by butterflies, and Ryan knows this, and so he's able to use it to his advantage. Anytime you're building those tools for someone that thinks like you, that's always the danger, right? When you're building tools, to say, well, someone's going to want this of this level of quality, and maybe that's true, but you always have to keep in mind what the band limits of that audience are. For this kind of electroacoustic composition, what's the audience on the maker side that would be interested in the tool that you're talking about? It's maybe a couple hundred people in the world, probably being generous there, right? Probably fewer. Most people would just be like, well, yeah, that sounds really cool, but that sounds like a lot of work and that's not my thing, and moving on. And so, that reaction was also really helpful to me to sort of position myself in the field and figure out, well, what am I really interested in going for? And sort of what are some of the goals, both compositionally and academically. So with that sort of long intro, I'm going to play one of my pieces. This was written in 2015 when I was in grad school. And another fun story because, John and I have worked together on so many things so closely over the last 10 years that sort of intertwined. I was in grad school at this time at Ball State, where Jeff Clark is now. I think Jeff came to present to you a little while ago. And I had sent this piece to John, which was a pretty big leap over the stuff that I was doing at GSU, and just to see what he thought. And I hadn't sent anything to him for a while. And I got a 1-sentence email that said, "This requires a response." That's all it said. And then like 2 months later, he sent me a link to this piece that was just devastatingly beautiful. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to stop here and stop trying. So, but this is Flux Beta. All right. So that's one piece. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. There's some things in the chat missing. Oh, just more Oasis stuff from Eddie. Thank you, Eddie. It's wonderful. Um, right. So I wrote a bunch of those pieces, and that was the primary, my primary creative outlet for quite a while. And then I started teaching in 2013, and teaching changes things. I think in some ways, being in a different community changes things, right? So in graduate school and sort of as initially as you're coming up as an academic, you're doing a lot of things that you're supposed to do to get published and working in a certain vein. And I enjoyed making these kinds of pieces, but I found both the performance side and the audience side a bit limited. And so one of the things that I wanted to do as a professor was, write music that I wanted to write in in the vein that I wanted to make, but also one that would have impact to my students, or that at least would be a bridge to my students. So I started investigating, more work in that vein and what that would look like. And so I'd always been interested, sort of the opposite side of this microsound compositional aesthetic is long tone ambient stuff. And so I got very into that. Also, I had kids around this time, so anything that can chill you out at that point is well worth your endeavor. So I got both lifestyle wise and compositionally got interested in that. And so I started working on pieces that were more ambient, both for instrumental electronics and just for solo performance. I also miss performing live. A lot of the pieces that I was working on are fixed and so played back in a concert hall, and that's wonderful and everything. But I did miss being on stage, not so much for the look at me being on stage, but I do think there's a piece of expression, right? I mean, a lot of us, almost all of us here, are performing musicians or have been at one time or another. And so there's just something about being on stage and being able to communicate that music in the moment with all of its flaws and imperfections and hopefully some perfections. And then having that interaction and response from the audience. I was up doing a show at SUNY Oswego before the pandemic, right on the Great Lakes. And a lot of my work is influenced by the environmental nature of Minnesota. We have the North Shore of Lake Superior here, which is my happy place. And so, there's a lot of inspiration from the environment of the state in my work. And when I was playing the work up there and, playing these pieces, there was kind of an immediate connection when I talk about the piece in the Great Lakes. We're sitting, 10 feet in this beautiful space right from the Great Lakes. And so there's this environmental connection to the music that has its own audience. So this is a performance, just a little cell phone video. I won't play the whole thing, so I want to get some discussion stuff from me and my good friend Tony Steve on vibraphone, actually filmed by John on my cell phone in Fredericksburg, Virginia, several years ago. I think that's from this performance. So this is a piece from my first solo album. This is called Along the North Shore. Gotta let that long tail fade. Yeah. So you can't yes, thank you. You can kind of see it in the right-hand corner. There's a video. All of these works have video. And there's a real connection between what the practice that came before it and this one, right? Even though they feel so different. Guitars heavily processed with granulators. At this time, I was using a lot of Max for Live objects. One that Aaron helped me rebuild. One of my favorite Max for Live objects is Munger. And I have the M4L plugin for that if you want it. Just let me know and I'll send that around because Aaron rebuilt that. It's beautiful, beautiful granulator. Really, really nice job. Through long reverb tails. And then using a Keith McMillan soft step to do a lot of pressure sensitive guitar swells in and out with really specific curves. You can hear, unlike the volume pedal, you can hear things curve up and slam down and slide and collide, blending different streams of the guitars, in the ambient texture to bring them together. So really decontextualizing the guitar in the same way that I was decontextualizing the sound in those granular pieces. Also the same idea of the one-to-one interactions, simple things like when the chords change, you have these big cuts in the video to sort of extend that audio narrative into the video work. All of that practice came from that micro sound composition, right? So that was sort of formed the basis of, many of the sort of the compositional rules and guidelines I put for myself in building these pieces. And so, I built out several records of these, and that got me back on the road touring. In this particular show, I had sold all my bass flight cases a long time ago. I didn't want to buy any guitar ones. And so I asked the conference host if he would loan me a guitar, and he did. It was like this $100 guitar that would just barely stay in tune. So you can hear me just whacking on it, trying to like bend my fingers to keep that thing from going out of tune immediately. And then after that show,
I had forgotten that Tony Steve was there. I'm remembering this now, and just hanging out. Shout out to Tony Steve.
Big shout out to Tony Steve. This was the weekend after the election. So musically, it was a powerful conference for all these creatives to be in one place and sort of have that connection and community. And that's one of the great things about being part of a composer community is that they've got so many people from all over the country and coming together to share that kind of music is great. I'm sorry, I missed a whole bunch of things in the chat, but I think most of it's Oasis, so I can ignore it. The clicky sound, do you mean like the granulated click stuff, or was there another glitch in there from the playback?
I think it was the strings from the guitar is from what you just said about the guitar not being in tune. I was just curious if it was the marimba.
No, Tony's playing the marimba pretty melodically. Yeah, just from the guitar itself. So that was my sort of second iteration. And then one of the things that I've been working on over a long period of time is doing some TV and film licensing, and I had some opportunities to work with some film libraries for placements in some shows. And so that was the impetus behind me kind of getting out of a creative funk and finishing my new album, which is called 12 Melodies. And this one is sort of the next step in the record that you just heard, and I'll play one of the tracks from it in a minute, with the same kinds of granular textures. Now I'm super obsessed with this Red Panda Particle 3 pedal. I was telling John about it. That's my newest obsession. It is beautiful real-time granulator. Does a lot of things really well. So that's all over this record, and you can kind of hear it in the background, granulated texture. So I'm still really drawn to that sound world, but now with even more of a sort of a minimalist layer. Artists like the Album Leaf and John Luther Adams kind of recalls that type of thing. So I'll go ahead and play one track. This is called Sometimes Years. So you can see, thank you. You can kind of see the progression of things over time. And that's one of the things, as we move into the discussion about entrepreneurship, that's one of the things I think is the truest mark of sustainability. Isn't necessarily excellence, although that's always helpful, but it's just hanging around. It's just hanging around for a long time and continuing to grow, continuing to evolve, continuing to grab the opportunities that are in front of you and saying, well, here's maybe the core identity of my artistic practice, but what are all of these sort of tributaries from the river that I can still be a part of while maintaining some semblance of the core? Even as things get kind of gradually more commercial, which kind of comes full circle to where I started, it's not the same, right? Sort of the Mark Twain quote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Like it rhymes. There are pieces of things that come before that are incorporated in this new practice. So nothing's really ever the same as you move to the end.
What strikes me about that is, so we have with Flux Beta, right? There's this extreme attention to detail of time-based events. And here what strikes me about this music is that there's this attention to detail about how timbres shift and the instrumentation that happens, which if you listen closely, you'll be rewarded. It reminds me a little bit of like Brian Wilson, Pet Sounds, where if you just listen to the songs, they're nice. Oh, wouldn't it be nice? But if you really listen, you'll hear all sorts of really interesting colors that really make the art. And so that for me is pretty interesting, that the level of detail, the listening detail shifts here to colors.
Yeah, thank you. And I do think that, one of the things that stuck with me deeply from my time at GSU was exactly what John said, because I've heard him say this so many times, is that, you're rewarded for the effort. There is a level of detail and sort of, going deeper and pushing yourself to that next level of creativity or of technology, that if you make that transition, if you make that iteration, there is some kind of reward. Maybe not the one that you thought it was going to be. And here, for me, it was both artistic and process oriented, making those granular pieces over such a long period of time. It taught me to be patient in the production process in a way that is not really part of a commercial practice necessarily. And then it taught me that, if you go to that level, you can create this whole other world of the composition, just like I was talking about. So yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. You can check out I've worked on so many records, and COVID has been awful for just about every reason imaginable, but it has been rewarding for me to catch up on just a wide variety of creative projects. So you can check them out on my website, michaeljamesolson.com. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. And so for the last part of my talk, I made it through there in about a half an hour. I did kind of rush it a little bit, but that's because I did want to spend most of my time on this. And it always happens that I go to do a guest artist thing somewhere. Well, now it's all virtual, but back in the day, they'd be like, go ahead and talk about your music. I'm like, no, I want to talk about students' careers. I'm happy to talk about my music, and we can listen to it and you can engage in it. Mostly just come to the concert, right? But I want to talk about, where we are sort of as a creative environment, and what are some of the boundaries that are self-imposed, what are some of the boundaries that are culturally imposed, and how we might think about ourselves individually, within this entrepreneurial space, maybe that's more individualized, right? That's more focused on potential careers. So I always like to start with this quote that it can't happen here. And one of the things that I think is, kind of baked into the opposite side of an entrepreneurial experience is that, well, you have to go to place X to make it. The lie for a long time was, well, you can't be successful unless you go to Nashville or New York or LA, right? That was sort of the 90s music industry. And then it's like, well, it's Austin or Atlanta or Chicago, or just pick your metro area. That if you live in a town of 30,000 people or 100,000 people or 5 people, that you're basically dead in the water. There's no opportunity for you. There's no hope for you. that's the end of the creative career. But if we just take a step back and think about the commercial music industry for a minute, that's really never been true. That's the craziest part of the big lie, is you have to move to a place to be successful. Because for decades, as the music industry has grown from its very inception, right, in the early 20th century, people are making the same kind of living in a rural area, gobbling up all the gigs around there, as many people are in big cities. That doesn't mean that there aren't more opportunities in some place, and maybe that's the best situational opportunity for you. But the idea that you have to be entirely location bound to make things happen, that's a lie. And of course, it's even more of a lie in this new economy. Now, the flip side of it, of course, is the number of people who will try to make it in the space that you're going is vastly exploded, right? So there's always a trade-off there. But there are a lot of ways that you can make your own path and make your own voice heard through this din. They used to call it cutting through the clutter back in the days when records were a thing, that where you can, build your own business or brand or creative career within this larger space. So, but location is a real issue, and oftentimes it's a psychological barrier, right? I was out giving a talk in Montana 2 years ago to a group of music technology students, and there the live event industry is big. This is in Bozeman. Bozeman's big live event industry, and students were really concerned about what the opportunities are. Bozeman's a town of about 60,000 people, although exploding, like a lot of Mountain West towns are right now. If you follow the news or the Times, you know that if you try to, go to Boise right now to buy a house, it's almost as expensive as going to a major market, right? That those areas are exploding. And so the students are wondering, what are the options for us? We don't come from these big places and we want to build a creative career. And the first thing I say is, well, what do you want to do, right? And inevitably, I want to be successful. And so we'll have to address that first, because that's not necessarily a thing that you want to do. That's an outcome. But the second is, look at the industry around you where you are. There's always an infrastructure around you. I have a good friend who just opened up a recording studio in COVID in a town of 15,000 people. He's got a lot of experience, just moved back from California because, it's very expensive to live out there and the live events industry is shut down. So time to make your own way doing something else. And, how would you even begin that process? Well, he knows that partnerships are the key to life. And so, you reach out to elementary schools to do school recording, and you reach out to churches to redesign their sound, and you build your client base up that way. So even in a time of really challenging infrastructure for studio and creative people, those kinds of partnerships can make it happen. So it's really important to break through that first psychological barrier of location. Wherever you are, you can make it work. In your own community right now, where I used to previously live, Chris Mitchell is a great example of that, right? Who works, do y'all know Chris or have been down to, it's still Plaid Dot, right? That's the store. So Chris has done about 1,000 different ventures, I think, that I've heard about him working on over the year: music store, recording studio, building amplifiers, maybe even guitars at this point.
Amplifiers and guitars, yeah, and he's doing well with that.
And all right. So there's an example of a guy, again, who starts in one direction, expands out in a town where you're like, I want to start a music store in Statesboro, Georgia. Well, good luck. Yeah, you can make it happen anywhere. But there, like anything else, there are considerations to how you build out your brand. So I think that's important. So we had the band from a Broadway musical called The Band's Visit come out to talk to us. I think Ryan was still here when they came out to talk to us. Right after they left, they won the Tony for Best Musical. And so while they were there, they were kind of in their pre-Tony phase. And we were talking to all of these Broadway session players about, the industry and how they came up and how they built their gigs and that kind of thing. And we asked Dean, who was the music director, what's one piece of advice that you would give anybody who's aspiring to go into the music industry? And he said this, and I love it, and I share it all the time: it's dangerous to pay someone to do something that you know nothing about. Which also honestly applies to contracting, as I have also learned with my house. I've gotten very good at being handy, simply because, I went to the wrong line of work, really. And I get quotes sometimes for things. I'm like, really, that's that expensive? So knowing a little bit about a lot of sections of the industry is so valuable when you're building partnerships, when you're looking to expand on your business. So what a plug for really, if you're in an entrepreneurial track, getting some experience with accounting, getting some experience with business. If you want to build software, getting some experience in the marketing space, right? And really figuring out how to target your market segments rather than leaving all of that up to somebody else. Anybody who wants to be in the music industry knows that there's a multifaceted business here where it's the intersection of art and technology and commerce and communication and audience building, all of those things. Doesn't mean you have to be an expert in all of those things, but for the same reason that I encourage people to learn a little bit about contract law, just having a lawyer sort of tell you exactly what's in the contract without you being a little bit curious about what's under the hood is a really challenging space. Okay, so what does this look like then practically? How do you orient yourself in this larger field and work towards building technology? So it's got to be more than recording studios and playing live music in bars, right? Because I think that's where most people's mind goes. I can go down and play for $50 or $100, and eventually those $100 add up to, rent money. Or I'll open a recording studio because that's all I can think of to do. But it's a much bigger industry than that. And so part of this, as I tell my students, is lifting your eye line to that next level of careers, to thinking what's possible. So I broke this down in my classes into 3 paths: audience building, product or services building, or creative connections. Okay. Now everything's a spectrum and there's lots of ways to combine these things together, but let's just look at sort of 3 large scale paths and maybe drill down a bit into what it would mean to move into these kinds of careers. And I separate this out from academia. Maybe some people have some designs on going to academia. That's its own separate, super messed up path that we could talk about some other times. And John has lots of good advice for moving forward in that vein. So one way to build an entrepreneurial path is to build an audience, right? And building an audience is now broader than ever. It's not just musical, right? It can be technical. And so one of the questions is, what's the lane that you want to pursue to build an audience that you can monetize? And that works in a lot of different ways. If we go back to the Plaid Dot example for a minute, which I hadn't really thought about, but it's kind of an interesting way to think about this. Somebody is more likely to buy Chris Mitchell's amps because they've gone to the store and either met him or had a guitar lesson there, right? The brand carries some cachet. And so just having that brand and having an audience for that brand, that's a filter for all these product chains. That's a great example of someone who's built up an audience over time, not just around one product, but around several, and able to make a career that's sustainable going on decades now. So you figure out what's your lane: education, technology, is it topics, spirituality, paranormal? I put that in there because one former student now is working with this paranormal channel that's going to launch this spring as part of this new creative startup. It's really wild. I don't have a lot of other details to share besides that. I think it's called Paraflix. So Jada will kill me for that if I tell her that. But
I knew that was going to happen.
That they were going to launch that, or that you knew that it was a thing? What? It's going to be a thing. So grabbing content creators around this space and throwing it through distribution channel. It's really incredible to watch, if you follow technology and industry blogs, to look at, over the past 10 years, look at the explosion of distribution channels. Just forget content for a minute, just the number of channels. Maybe you in your own life subscribe to 2, 3, 4, 5 services. I mean, it seems like every day the number of streaming services that you can subscribe to expands, and those catalogs get deeper and deeper and deeper in time. Me as an HBO nerd, of course I can't live without it. As my students know, I talk about HBO all the time. They have that whole classic movie section now with they've got the comics side, they've got this huge streaming service with this massive catalog, and the hunger for content has multiplied as well. And we've seen this in streaming services. If you're a podcast person, I'm also a podcast person because I consume a lot of media. Just the sheer number of podcasts that are able to be monetized on every topic imaginable. It's incredible. And the demand for that is, I don't know if we're in a bubble, but we're certainly in an expansion, right? Where the demand seems to be creeping up and up and up and up. So not just on the content side, but on the technological side, those jobs keep increasing because of how big the industry is getting for content and content creation. So if you're I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring the chat very well. I thought it was just mostly Dingus. Yeah, I'm not gonna say anything else about Dingus. Yeah, thanks a lot, Artie. Appreciate that. I'm gonna get in trouble for that. So thanks for doing that. I wonder if that letter of recommendation is ever gonna come. So building that audience, you find your lane first, right? And then you have some questions to answer about your lane. So one of the first things that I talk to with students about if they want to build a brand or build an audience in a space is, how much do you really want to do this? Is this a hobby or a business for you? Because then the first two questions you're going to ask yourself is, can you create content consistently? So I run a songwriting and production program. I have a lot of creative artists that come through and they say, well, I want to build my career around writing songs. I'm like, great. So you owe me a song a week, all semester, right? And so for the first couple of weeks, that's okay. By week 4, I get emails of like, oh, I'll get it to you by Friday. And by week 6, the tears, right? So we're 6 weeks in. And I'm only asking for 32 songs in 9 months. That's not a lot of songs. And the same thing goes on the business side. I'm like, well, if you want to build your artistry, can you post clips of yourself working on your music twice a week on Instagram? I just made that up. Twice a week. Can you commit to that? And inevitably the answer is no. Well, why not? Well, I got a lot of other things going on, and at the risk of sounding like one of those Instagram foolish philosopher hashtag people, what stands in the way becomes the way, right? You've probably heard that quote 1,000 times, attributed to, I think, Marcus Aurelius. So if the blocks are, well, I've got a lot of other things going on, that will go on forever. Or as I tell people who graduate college, it's about to get a lot worse. Like bills and health insurance, everything else. Like, welcome to that part of the world, right? So it's going to get worse. And so if you're somebody who wants to build a business in an entrepreneurial space, these aren't just sort of, well, it'll all get better when I'm done with school, when I graduate from college, when I'm done with my master's, when I'm finally settled, it'll all be, it's a question for now. It's one of those gut check moments. Can you commit to being that person who posts twice a week in whatever your lane is? I have another student now who makes like sort of this funky trap music stuff, but now he posts videos about himself making it. Like, here's how I made it with this synth, right? So is that directly related to his music? Yeah, kind of. But people sometimes are more interested in the how-to than in the music itself. So that's a legitimate way to build a following. And once you have that following built, you can move it into another lane. But you have to have a core identity, and you have to be willing to be consistent. How frequently are you going to build that content and volume? When you start, if you're a sort of a songwriting person, or if you want to work on the content creation side and you're looking to get hired at a company or to work with a publisher, one of the first questions they ask you is, how much stuff do you have? The question isn't, is it awesome? It's probably not terrible if you got the meeting, but the question is, how much? Because how much is a function of how productive you will be. So if you're going into meetings, or if you're saying to yourself, well, I'll be productive when, that when is never coming. That help is never coming. So that's a tough internal lesson to really work through, right? If I want to be a content creation person, I have to actually create content. So we'll come back to that too. Hope this is not too dour. But Andrew and Ryan are already used to this. They're really used to this sort of dourness. Andrew's just shaking his head. I've heard this 1,000 times. So partnerships. And what other creators in your lane can you partner with? What secondary or tertiary revenue streams can be created? right? So partnering with people, featuring with people, producing other people's music in addition to your music, all of those kinds of things together work to build an audience. Like, it's incredible. I don't know if any of you released music commercially, and I love the new Spotify analytics tools where you can kind of compare yourself against audiences or check out other audience streams. And it's unbelievable to see the difference between your catalog numbers, or in this case, my catalog numbers, and the ones that are featured on playlists. It's about 100x. I mean, it's not even close. Why? Because you're associated in this. And, since I have some spooky sounding music, of course, music that's not necessarily tonal is always called spooky. And so you get on these spooky playlists. It's incredible. Like, people will, right? It's associated with that space. The same kind of thing with if you're featuring other artists in your music or featuring other artists' music, that's a way to co-build an audience. And your goal, if you're in the audience building business, is, and this is the key part, to build an audience from wherever that audience can be built. You're a gatherer, right? You're a gatherer of people for content that you're building.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, playlists on Spotify, for instance, who are those curated by? And can you sort of take that market too, and maybe collaborate with these secondary, tertiary streams? Like, well, I'll put you on my playlist, but reciprocate. Or is that what happens? I'm not familiar with this.
So there's many different kinds of playlists. If it's a Spotify curated list, like those big collections that you see, those are Spotify curators, and they have their own algorithms to grab people there. But there are plenty of listener curated playlists, artist picks on people's pages. There's a lot of ways to get onto collections of playlists together. But what you're suggesting, John, is sort of like the 21st century version of gig swapping. Like, hey, I'll come up to Richmond and can I come up to Richmond and play? And then when you come to Statesboro, play here, right? That's how bands built audiences for decades. And that's how people built things from the ground up, is intense gig swapping all around the country. That's how you built a tour, right? Is building all those kinds of relationships. So that idea, we tend to get real siloed on the digital side, right? We're behind a computer. Oftentimes we're not meeting real humans. We're trying to network around the world. And so it can feel very sort of one-to-one interaction as opposed to building a community. But that's really what it is. You're building this larger community.
It's so interesting what you're talking about, because recently I just ran across something featured on a social media app, and it was this guy Whistleface, and he does house music. I have no idea where he's located, but now that I tuned in, I was like, oh, that's actually really good. And now it pops up occasionally, and now he's introduced me to the fact that he streams on Twitch, right? And I don't go on Twitch, but because I know how to get to him there, now I'm interested in the Twitch stream. And then it made me think about all of the other people that I'm missing on those platforms, and how amazing it was that this person came into my existence in some way. And really what it is that he does this every Tuesday, right? So every week he does an hour stream on this social media site, and then moves over to Twitch and does it consistently in the same way with content that he likes to do. He's just a DJ, but it sounds great.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you guys are like this too. I follow lots of artists on Instagram. I follow a lot of hashtags on Instagram. So that's one of the ways I get to discover new stuff. And it's just like following those things. And it's incredible to watch those top curators build an audience by doing exactly what you said. Richard Devine does the same thing, right? He's, arguably one of the more successful experimental electronic music producers that we have in the world. And he's doing Instagram live or just like uploading tons of clips of him in his studio several times a week. Even now, he's like 20 years, maybe longer into his career. The stamina of these guys, I follow a whole bunch where they're just, in the studio, twisting knobs, uploading. I follow Volcasynths. You can see some Volcasynths back there that I love. Hashtags, people with potted plants, running them through guitar pedals to create 2-minute videos, and doing that 5 or 6 times a week. And on some level, you're just like, well, who cares? Well, who cares about the album you just produced either, right? It's all about building content and an audience. And jump with us in the chat. It's actually something I talk about all the time. that quantity is a quality all its own, right? We're in a culture where your visibility is part of your vibrancy. So when you disappear creatively, you're not on the top of the map. And with so many content creators and that democratization of content, that becomes an issue for brand building. So that's a real gut check though, right? If you want to be this kind of person who creates content, then you got to be a content creator consistently with volume. In our songwriting program, we talk about writing at pace. You have to be a pace writer. You've got to churn this stuff out. And if that kind of grabs you and makes you feel soulless, then that's probably not the space for you, right? There's that great Dr. J quote that I always twist for music that says, being a professional is doing the thing you love on the days you don't want to do it, right? That's content creation. When if what gives me joy is to be inspired to create content, then that's wonderful. And that is a wonderful amateur place to be, but that's not a professional place to be. Does that make sense? It's not necessarily an either or thing. I'm not trying to say you have to be joyless, but if the source of creation comes from inspiration, you might be inspired in your 20s, but what if there's a 7-year stretch or a 5-year stretch when you don't feel like it? What if you're 34 and you don't want to make stuff anymore? And that's what you built, that's a real, you're going to find yourself in those places. Life isn't going to be all inspiration forever. And for some of you, creation is relatively new. People here are, in their early 20s, maybe you've only been writing music for 5, 6, 7 years of your life. So there's still that fresh, new, tactile piece to creating content. And once that wears off, it's a pretty steep cliff. Because I talk to people about this all the time, right? Where they just hit the wall creatively and are like, I need to switch careers, or I need to get out of this. And part of my counseling to them is, well, let's go back. What's the place that you're writing from? That's why I frustrate my students all the time by spending an entire course just on process. From the start of your process to the end, process, process, process. Because if we fix the process piece, the content piece will follow. It's all about your creative process. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the second piece, product or services building. I know R2D2 back there, who's making food now in his kitchen. So Ryan, do not worry about presenting a professional face to this class or this presentation. You just make the wonderful food that you're going to make.
I'm listening very closely.
I believe that you are. Ryan was also the bartender at number 4 for a while, so he gets a pass from me forever because of that.
This is just my style in Zoom calls. This is how I pay attention better. I'm a different kind of learner.
Yeah, that's just fun. All right, so product or services. So this would be developing and launching a products company. So one of the things that when students or young entrepreneurs are interested on the product side, right, this has evolved quite a bit as a program from when I was there, was primarily sort of creative, compositionally based. Now it's incredible to see all of the amazing technology and apps and plugin development and other kinds of creative endeavors that y'all are working on. It's inspiring for me, for sure, to see the breadth of where this program has gone. And that might lead some of you down to build a company around software, around a niche. Maybe it's, boutique pedals are exploding. Boutique everything is exploding, right? There seems no end in sight. When I was at NAMM 2 years ago, that there's all these brands out there, but when you're on the 3rd floor of the convention center to see the 50th boutique, Strat Tele company, and you're like, how is it possible that all these companies exist and are thriving? It's really incredible to see the demand for people to create products or services that meet a specific need. I'm always blown away by that. And that musical instrument and software, right, both the hardware and the software side, just continues to explode. And I mean, that's really impressive. So when you move into that space, especially as musical and technological people, you may or may not have the corresponding skill sets that build that company. One of the things I think the academic parallels basically write themselves. there's the image that people have of the like, oh, I'm going to be a professor and I'm going to write my music and get up there and lecture in front of my class and everyone's going to love me and I'm going to have my summers off and it's going to be so wonderful. And then it's like, then the reality, or it's the what my friends think I do and what I actually do. Remember those memes, those old school kind of memes. And then the reality is like, well, I'm going to fill out paperwork for 5 hours today and then go to a few meetings where people yell at me, right? So the reality, now I'm being a little facetious there, but like the reality certainly is different than the impression of it. The same thing is with building a company, both on the services side and on the product side, right? So if you're a services oriented company, regardless of what your service is, you're a customer service company, especially on the music side, right? So it's all about the service. We had Tom Beamer, who is a lead engineer, worked with Joni Mitchell, a bunch of other companies, alumni of our program, who's worked in New York for a long time. And he said when he started at the studio, I forget the studio's name off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Tom, if you ever see this. When he started there as an intern and sort of a low-level employee, his job was to make sure the soap dispenser was always perfectly filled. His job was to make sure that there were no pencil shavings from a pencil still on the pencil, that they were perfectly sharpened and everything was in its spot. His job was to make sure that there was never a smudge of dirt on the towel hanging in the washroom, that the floors were always perfectly clean, that the minute somebody even thought that they would want a cup of coffee, that they were there with coffee. And so in the course of the conversation, my colleague Scott asked him, he's like, we haven't even talked about music yet. And he said, we don't need to. When you are working at that level of a studio, if you're a world-class facility and you want Paul McCartney, one of their clients, Joni Mitchell, like these superstars of the industry to come to your space, they can get the gear anywhere. They can get the engineer anywhere. What separates that studio from the other world-class studios on the street has to be that small sliver on the top. Can we be just a tiny bit better at making them comfortable in the environment and serving them in our environment than our competitors? If the answer is yes, the artist is coming back. That's pretty eye-opening, right? If I only had that piece of gear, if I only had this space, right? That's sort of the music technology mindset coming into in this case, a recording studio business. But then the reality of operating that business has really very little to do with the gear is a given. That's assumed, right? The quality of the engineer, that's all assumed. It's now down to the experience. So if you own the studio, to sort of continue to go on that example, you're in the customer service business first, primarily, and probably always. Secondarily, you're in the recording music business. That's how they think about it. And they're extremely successful based on that model, as all world-class studios are to some degree or another, right? How soft the couch is more important than if the LA 610 is operational that day. Oh, that probably matters too. But right, you see the difference there, yeah? When you get to that level, everyone's playing on that field. So if you're a services person, it's not just what gear you have to offer, it's the experience you have to offer around that. Same on the product side. I mentioned this to Ryan earlier, and I often talk about this with entrepreneurs when they're looking on the product side. You're designing what you want and that you see a market need for, but the experience is always the end user. And there's no better way to sort of get a feel for that than to, do what you're doing now, building software, coding, right? You get a real feel for what works and what doesn't, what's intuitive or what doesn't. And the sort of mind-blowing piece, taking a step back on the software development side or building apps or getting a really high-level technology training and stepping back to end userville, right? Back here is how much so many of the things that we value up here don't matter at all to them. So you're really looking at, and hopefully you get a chance, you should invite Ricky to come talk about this because they've got beautiful tools that have developed over time, and looking at their market in the game audio space is really incredible to see how the tools have evolved in ease of use and sort of keeping the experimental piece that separates them from the rest of the commercial world in the software development game, but also allows end users to access those experimental. That's a tough needle to thread. And Delta Sound Labs has done it about as well as anybody, making really beautiful stuff. Okay. What market need are you trying to fill? Or maybe you are, bold and brave enough to create one, right? To see an opportunity and to just go all for it. And the reason I say bold and creative is when you see a need in service or in product, you have to build that market, often location bound. And if you're a creative person, then this is the eternal frustration of creative people. What you see is not common. You're not common people. Your brains don't necessarily work like everyone else's around you or the way you'd like them to work. So you're going to have to go through that process step by step, bit by bit, and bring everyone else along with a whole lot of determination and a very long time horizon. Okay. Those companies are going to take a long time to build that audience. Okay. Creative connections. And then I'll do a few wrap up things, and I'd love to have a little bit of a discussion. So creative careers, right? I came up building my career entirely as a creative, just making music and making records. And so I was fortunate enough to do that for a long time before I went into academia. And these are kind of I went through all of these, a few of these before, but I think they're really valuable. Your lane needs to include as many surrounding lanes as possible. Maybe this is not so applicable to graduate students, but undergraduate students, this is one that they fight tooth and nail. I want to write music X. I want to go in direction X. And I say, great, that's wonderful. Direction X is your primary channel. Now let's look to directions, Y and Z, everything that surrounds X, and say, how can we build a larger creative practice around the thing that you do? Right? So maybe you want to write, country music or contemporary music in a specific lane. So what are the other things that you can do that are associated with this? Excuse me. I have several students in my program who want to write church music and, kind of do that kind of thing. And so I encourage them to build up their skills in leading a band so they can get a church worship leader job, and then they can work on some string arrangements, right, for orchestral stuff and all the other lanes that are around that one space. Because you're going to need to monetize. Sorry, got a bunch of stuff. I really hate email. After the pandemic's over, I'm going to delete every account that I have and never. I'm going to live in a mountain. I'm not going to speak to anyone. Be all alone.
Why wait?
It's a good. I think about that often, John. I really do. Okay. Connections are made in the unlikeliest places. This is one of the biggest truisms of your creative career. It's the people, the people on this call, that's your cohort, right? Whether you vibe with them creatively or not, and the connections they have and that network that they build out, that's the starting place of where you work as a creative. And so you have to be nimble enough and flexible enough to go into a space that you know nothing about and just take a chance. Creativity is about taking risks. So you also have to take risks on what you want to create. I just think about those who want to stay in the very narrowest lane possible and ignore all the other lanes around them. I wanted to write sort of alternative pop, Weezer Mates, Fountains of Wayne music. That's all I wanted to do, And then 7 years later, I'm in the studio making country records. It's a totally different thing. But what I really wanted to do was write stuff. At that time, I really wanted to just write songs. And so I'll just write with anybody, anywhere, in any style, and just keep building and building and building and building. And you never know when those connections will come back around. So it's your job as a creative to be broadly drawn. We had another artist who was just on the charts the other day, Dessa, from a collective called Doomtree. Incredible artist. And two quick anecdotes about Dessa that I love. The first one was, she's been a successful indie artist for a very long time. She was part of the Hamilton mixtape. Someone had tweeted at Lin-Manuel Miranda to do something. I don't know if it was about Janet Yellen specifically, but it was about the new cabinet. And so Dessa picked that up and did this great track called, I think it's something about Yellen, right? So just kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing about Janet Yellen becoming our new Treasury Secretary. And it blew up immediately. You know, Janet Yellen retweeted it, the Treasury Department, and it got picked up by all of this media. And then it soared up the charts. And I'm watching her socials, and then she's just like, well, this is weird. You know, just having this song just climb, opening up a whole new dynamic for her. She came to campus a year or so ago, well, 2 years ago before the pandemic. And she was working, she's a hip hop artist, right? Kind of hardcore roots, not hardcore, but like, you know, really intense indie roots hip hop. Great stuff. Check out Dessa and Doomtree. And she was asked to do a collaboration with the Minnesota Orchestra, which is a wonderful orchestra in the US, to do some of her songs sort of in this hip hop format. Now, if you're part of this underground indie circuit, you have an audience that's built in, right? That's who you are. That's the audience built in. And the orchestra audience, those who go to Orchestra Hall in Minneapolis, that's probably not the same audience as what she has. And she's not worked in this space before. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense right on the surface. So they go into the creative meeting, and she was telling us over lunch, she said, when I got there, the first two questions I asked were, what kind of drinks are going to be at the bar? Because my audience is Jack and Coke, you know, beer. Let's get some Northeast. We have a lot of amazing breweries in Minneapolis. Let's get some local beers on tap, because that's what my audience is comfortable with. And can I do, you know, people dress up to go to the symphony? So I'd like to do a promotion that you can come in your prom dress and you know, combat boots, which is what they did, right? So her entire consideration was just about the connection that she could make with her audience in that space. I thought that was a brilliant anecdote. You know, how do you make your audience feel comfortable in Orchestra Hall when they'd rather be down at the Caboose or at First Avenue or anything else? You help build the environment and the infrastructure around there that brings them along. The collaboration was, you know, sold out, and they've done several of those since, and it's become kind of a staple of the Minnesota, and especially the Minneapolis music scene. But it just goes to show you that that unlikely collaboration between a hip hop artist and the orchestra works in part because the core identity of that artist is transported into this new space. She didn't change who she was to be in this new space. She made that space more inviting for her. I think that's a really powerful anecdote for how we look at creativity and how flexible we need to be as creatives to make our way in this new environment. And I said this before, amateurs write when they feel inspired, professionals still write when they feel nothing, right? You still have to be able to channel the pieces of inspiration that make you write and create initially into times when you don't feel like it. Because writing at pace, creating at pace, and creating with volume is critical to being a creative in today's environment. All right. So last couple things, and then we'll discuss. So I saw this, we had another guest artist come in and said, you know, how do you build an independent career that lasts 20 years? We bring a lot of mid-career artists in for this exact reason. We like to bring people in their 50s, you know, who are maybe in the middle or tail end of their creative careers, because we want to know, as a music industry program where I teach, how do you make it 20 years, right? Like, you know, so many of my students, and maybe you felt like this too, maybe you feel like this now, they have a vision for their career that lasts until they're 27. Like they have a very good plan for 19 or 20 to 27. Music that fits that demographic, a style that fits that demographic, an ethos, all of those kinds of things. But they don't have a plan for their 30s. Because that plan that worked when you were, you know, you looked young and you kind of fit that target demo that's easier to reach, that's stickier, that's not going to be there 7 years after graduation. It's crazy to think about that, right? Or 5 years after graduation even. That's wild to think about. So we need a plan and a time horizon that looks farther. And one of the best pieces of advice they gave says, you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable as an entrepreneur. That's tough. That's a tough message. Entrepreneurship isn't for everyone. Starting a business isn't for everyone. That's uncomfortable. I get a lot of seniors in their sort of more broken down moments, which seems like all the moments for all of us in COVID times. So just like we're all hanging on by a thread emotionally and with our physical and mental health, saying, I just want to be comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would never begrudge anybody the feeling of safety and comfort and just a steady income. But it's important to be realistic about what it looks like to be a creative and to be young and building a business. It doesn't look like that. It looks like being uncomfortable. You know, there's that in so many movies, you hear that quote when, you know, in these war movies, sorry to bring it to a war movie analogy, it's like, well, accept that you're already dead and you'll be able to fight, kind of a thing, right? It's sort of accept that you're going to be uncomfortable and then you'll be able to create and move forward. But such a tough place to be. But if you get that, so many of these hurdles are psychological, right? If you go over that hurdle, then you're better able to vision for what your career looks like next. And pathways are built through networks. Build your network, network with everyone that you can. When conferences are a thing again, and you can go out to Game Sound Con and just go shake hands with a bunch of people and meet a few people, that does more for you than just sitting on your computer saying, if only this audio was 10% better. Oh man, if this volume curve this drop is just, oh, the tightest drop possible, then everybody will love my music, right? Said no one really ever. It's about building that network. That's also uncomfortable for a lot of us, is to build that network out. But inevitably, the opportunities come from the people you know. We hire the people we know. You all start, if you played in a band before, it's like, well, who's playing bass down the block or in the dorm next door, or a friend of a friend, right? That's just how the music industry works. So you can build that network too, but you got to put yourself out there. All right. That's what I had for y'all today. Thank you all so much for listening.
Wow, great talk. That's inspiring for me, especially. I think that the point you make about volume is particularly hits home for me with what I see with a lot of students, and what I would advise almost anybody here is that you actually have to crank out a lot more than you think. And sometimes you have to crank it out and leave behind the notion of perfection, for sure. And I think Michael says, and a lot of people says, you can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. And especially if you think about quantity being its own quality, that's especially true. I'm going to put on mute and let you guys ask some questions.
So you said you were getting back into licensing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you kind of had a gap in the middle where you didn't do it as much, and then you're pushing it again. How has it changed coming back to it now, and is your strategy different?
Yeah. So when I got into it, I was right again. Like I said, the holiday records are sort of Fountains of Wayne meets Weezer, sort of in this upbeat, poppy kind of style with big sing-song melodies. That's what I did for a long time. And so there was a market for that in the early 2000s that I was able to fill with a lot of TV licenses. Now that dynamic, it's not the early 2000s anymore, so that genre is not something that's going to make me any money. It's got to be something more current. And also, we've seen a shift on the licensing side away from tracks and much more to what I call like half active instrumentals. And what I mean by that was there was a large, yes, legit Midwest pop punk. That's true. Long history of that here. It's a replacements town. For a long time, that licensing piece would be a lot of what we call -1 tracks, which is basically it's the actual track, just no vocals, right? Which makes sense because you can't have vocals in the background. So we'd license a lot of -1 tracks of our music out too, which is basically all the instrumental beds. Well, the problem with that, and I think why you've seen that on the decline, is one, shows like to use a lot more music now than almost they ever have before. And when they use, this is also kind of network dependent because not all networks function like this. When they do use them, they want to have things that are rhythmic but not obnoxious. So it tends to be that tempo matching drums, if they're really prominent drums, if it's aggressive drumming, that gets really difficult. So when one of the companies I worked with reached back out to me and said, hey, do you have anything? We have this new project. And I was like, no, I don't write music anymore. I teach. We were talking through like, well, what are you looking for? And inevitably it was like, well, we're looking for instrumental stuff 30 seconds to a minute that would have either, you know, a tail from a big moment or a build up to a bigger moment that would have some stuff going on, but not be too obnoxious. And that's like, honestly, that's most of what I put on this new record. I put a couple of drum pieces on there, but that's most of what I did because I was looking to go back into that licensing space. And then I did this, and this is good advice. Well, all of my advice is excellent advice, as my former students know, but this is really good advice, is if you're going to build out tracks for licensing stuff, go back into those tracks and then just chop them up. So like sometimes here's a good example. That's 3 different tracks in my licensing catalog now as stubs of that master. So that if the scene is 30 seconds long, if they just need a 30-second pad that has kind of that piano piece to a buildup, I've got it. Right, I have to rework some of the files and rework some of the tracks. Or if I want a 1.5-minute one, the same kind of thing. Yeah. No, I don't do libraries. No, I do one-off. Well, I'll license to a library of a show, but I won't license to a big library. So I don't know if everyone's interested in sound publishing, but sort of the way it works is, you know, there are these massive library farms essentially, which will just gobble up as much indie music as they can. You know, it's becoming, with more and more content platforms, it's becoming less common that you have soundtracks built of really prominent stuff. You know, I was watching The King of Staten Island again because I'm obsessed with HBO, and it was amazing to see, you know, they're licensing Lil Wayne and all this other stuff, which I just don't hear all that much. I see a lot of indie tracks, but I just don't hear a lot of really prominent stuff anymore. It's a lot of indie stuff. And the reason that indie stuff gets licensed is because if you make it and you own it, then the only clearance they need to do is to send you an email or give you a call. And you're cheap. So those 3 things together, like that's much better than trying to license Uproar for something, right? When I got to call 30 people and negotiate these huge, it's a big time waste. So there's a big advantage to being an indie artist in this space if you can design and build the music for it. Did that answer your question, or did I talk around it, Ryan?
Yeah, that was it. I was just wondering if it's worth doing sound libraries, or if you just kind of do your own personal network and then you just have your website to host it.
Yeah, it's much better. Now, one, because you remember the business world, just like anything else, is all about incentives. You know, if you license your music to a library that has 30,000 tracks, let's just say, and they service 1,000 shows, I'm just pulling those numbers out of the air. You know, what's the incentive for them to push your song into one of those shows? 0. Right? There's no incentive there at all. So from my perspective, could you get a hit there? Sure, you could, but it's unlikely to get your placements that way. It's much more likely if you hold out and really, you know, pitch stuff to publishers or pitch stuff to supervisors and kind of build your network that way, build your credibility that way so that you're somebody they come to. Now, if they're asking you to put it on a pitch reel that's going to go out with 30 tracks and they're going to pick 10 for the show, that's great. But that's very different than just having your music sit as a non-exclusive license in a library, hoping that you're going to get a placement. You know, could happen, probably not going to happen. Did that answer the question? Yeah, and then I'd build a big library. You know, I got really lucky very early on. My library was 15 tracks when I first got something out, and then those 15 were used over and over and over. And we weren't at that time interested in building a licensing library. You know, we were trying to be the biggest band in the world, right? Like all 20 somethings. And so that wasn't a thing. Now going back into licensing, you know, you see the value of having 200, 300, 400 tracks that you can pull from at a moment's notice. Because the thing is, once you build those you know, Andrew and Ryan worked with Scott Laguerre, who is a former engineer with Prince and also did a lot of marketing stuff for a long time building sound libraries. And he would always, you know, I'd ask you, why would you get out of a gig that is so lucrative? You know, it's so lucrative to be in this space. And he's like, once you get on, you don't get off because you're not getting back on again. So you build these relationships. They ask you for some tracks. Great, you send them. They come back again, you don't have them. You know what I'm saying? Those emails start to go down. So when you hop on and you start building this thing up, you have to just keep going. You know, there's no incentive for Richard Devine to do Instagram lives of his, I mean, he's, you know, he can go to any conference he wants, he can tour, but he's still doing it. Do you know what I'm saying? It's that grind. You start the grind, you keep the grind, and you grind until you're done. It's not like, well, I'm going to take a month off, or you know, you just keep going. I mean, that's the reality. They're wheeling Frank Sinatra out on the stage when he's half in a gurney, right? You've seen those stories before. It's like, I'm not suggesting that you need to buy into the brutal capitalistic music industry, but I am suggesting that, you know, especially as you're building your career, your value to somebody as a partner where you're not a stakeholder in their success is what you can do for them. And once you can't do anything for them, you're not valuable to them anymore, and you're just done. You're off that carousel. You know, that's the thing. When we move into the business world, it's not like, oh, we're all friends here. You know, it's a business, it's money, and the deadlines are tight. And especially for visual stuff, it's not like, oh, 6 months, you'll have 6 months to build this track or a month to build this track. It's like, we need it tomorrow. Because you know what drives the world of video games and Hollywood. It's not music. They're happy to have you, but you're a very small part of their business. They're not making $1 billion because the soundtrack is tight. They're making $1 billion because the animation and the storyline or some Marvel thing or whatever else. You know, that's just the reality. Don't you get ripped off by sound libraries? A guy that I watched, Ben Jordan, said something about libraries at one point. I remember being critical. I'm not a fan, like I said, I'm not a fan of just sending your music into a library. So there's two different deals. I hope I'm not talking this to death. Exclusive and non-exclusive. Never, ever, ever sign an exclusive deal with anyone unless they are paying you a boatload of money. That's just good life advice, because once you're in an exclusive library, that's the end of your music until the term of that contract is done. So never do that. I'm neutral on non-exclusive libraries where, you know, you license your music to a library. If they place it, there's a 50-50 payment or whatever you negotiate. And then on the, but then you can sign up with as many non-exclusive libraries as you want. Sometimes they're non-exclusive libraries, but you can't sign up for any other library, which is a weird deal. And so, you know, never do that. Or if it's a non-exclusive library and you just can't pitch to competing shows, that's fine. Because, you know, non-competes are very standard if you're working with one company in a specific direction. But yeah, never, I mean, if there's someone presents you with an exclusive deal that's like, we'll pay you if you get placed, you know, never, ever, 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 ever sign that. Ever. I'm not a contract lawyer, but even I know that part. Never do that. That's not good. On a website last year and learned that I made $10 when I got a tax document. There you go. Yeah, that's about like my Spotify royalties. I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm never going to see this money, and it'll be nice to go. Yeah, but TV and film placements on both sides. You know, there's a lot of money to be made in that space. You know, commercial placements can go anywhere from $2,000 to, you know, 10 grand or so. It's probably in the middle of that range. Now we're talking about broadcast television. Cable can be a little less than $2,000 usually. But those things air forever. And then film film's a crapshoot. $0 to $20,000, depends on what their budget is. You know, if you're an indie track and they're like, we have money left over, they're just gonna throw money at you. It's pretty easy to get that kind of stuff. And the cool thing about licensing to TV is that it goes around the world forever. You know, I was in some MTV reality shows early on, and I still get checks from Central Asia and, you know, these smaller markets, because you just think about it. When you produce content in the US, this is one of the most expensive content creation places in the world. The licensing and syndication rights are very expensive. But over time, some shows just don't have the cachet. Anybody really excited about watching, you know, repeat episodes of The Real World Denver that aired in 2006? I'm guessing not many of you, right? So the rights to that content's pretty cheap. And so, as you might imagine, it gets licensed across the world. It moves around the globe, and all of those residual royalties add up. I was talking with a film composer one time, just asking him what his plans were long-term, because I'm obsessed with that, you know, kind of obsessed with career sustainability. It's part of one of my areas of interest. And he said, it's my royalty statements. That's my retirement account. right? All the residuals from the films I've been in, the residuals from the shows I've been in. And that's how he viewed it, right? That he put his retirement in those residuals. That's a powerful motivation for him to get up every day and write and write and write and write. And so once we sort of put, I think the 10,000 foot view is we kind of put creativity in this hopeful monetization box, like it's a down the road kind of thing, or in this I'm never going to monetize it. But the reality is closer to, am I the person, or do I want to become, because we can all evolve and change and grow, the person who does this and follows these best practices? It's really an internal thing. Who are you, and who do you want to be? And that's pretty exciting. You're all at the beginnings of your career. There's a million directions you can go. You can try something and fail, and try something else and fail, right? Failure is a necessary component to success. So, think about these kind of things, and bet on yourself. Take a chance on yourself, because the flip side of this is I get emails every day, or Facebook messages, from friends or former students who didn't, and who want to get back into this now in their 40s. That's a tough road. Tough road to take 20 years off and be like, well, now here's my second career. I want to start over. I'm like, can you get an internship? They're like, yeah, but I got a mortgage and a couple cars to pay for. I'm like, you're done. That's it for you. So this is the time to take a risk, take a chance, bet on yourself. And I'm excited to see what you all come up with.
Well, thanks a lot, Michael. It's been great having you. This is a really good talk. I think you can reach Dr. Olson at his email address, which is m@michaeljamesolson.com. And I have to go and teach some more, because my quantity of teaching certainly matters. And yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And I'll post this video up on YouTube. I'll stop the recording now.